is at the center of everything we do, not only in our livelihoods, but also in terms of the potential financial and economic development that it brings. We have, as a region, we have great opportunities, but we are also facing deep changes that always come from technology. And as an integrated region, energy plays a crucial role. And I think we are lucky to have Jesús, Spencer, Courtney, and Jaime to explain how all of this comes together. And I will try to make it a conversation that goes from the very general to the more specific of not only, of course, not energy as a whole, but electricity in particular, and how it takes on the manufacturing of both the electric components that are important for electricity generation and infrastructure in general, but also in terms of what it brings to the rest of the economy. So I'd like each of you to introduce yourselves in a brief way, and then we can start the conversation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Great to be with you all today. My name's Courtney Rosellini. I lead government affairs for the Americas region for TE Connectivity, which is a global manufacturer of electronic components. We specialize in sensors, connectors, relays, switches that go into next generation automotive solutions, aerospace, defense, medical devices, increasingly energy and energy grid solutions, along with AI and data centers. So relevant to this conversation today, and happy to be here in Mexico City.
Jesús Carmona, president of Schneider Electric for Mexico and Central America, and Schneider Electric is the global leader, and in Mexico, the leader in energy management and industrial automation.
Spencer?
Good morning. My name is Spencer Pederson. I'm the Senior Vice President for Public Affairs at NEMA, the National Electrical Manufacturers Association. NEMA represents over 350 electrical manufacturers in the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Thank you for having me.
Hi, good morning. Buenos días. My name is Jaime Zabludovsky. My call to fame, if any, is that I was fortunate enough to be the deputy chief negotiator for NAFTA in the early 90s. Since then I left government, and we have today a consulting firm, IQOM Inteligencia Comercial. I'm the vice president of IQOM. We have been the senior advisor for Mexican private sector. We were the senior advisor for the renegotiation of NAFTA for USMCA. And today we run the office of the Mexican private sector in Washington. Thank you.
Well, Jaime, as you of all of us know much more, or all there is to know about trade, I think for much of the past 30 years, integration among the three North American countries has been sort of it has never been under scrutiny. It has never been doubted. And lately, I think it's not a question of how fast, how deep, what sectors, but rather an if. Are we going to keep walking in that direction? And what does that mean for this sector in particular and our countries in general? So I would like you to pick your brain on that. And how do you see if this situation, is it inevitable? Are we going to have to understand the relationship both in trade terms and in almost all economic situations between the three different countries? Is it something that we need to learn, a new reality? How do you see that?
Well, I'm going to give you two answers, a short one and a long one. The short answer is that it's inevitable. I do think that integration is unstoppable. I don't see any way to unscramble the omelette. When we started the formal process of integration, and then let me go to the long answer. The way the integration is going to proceed depends very much on what happens over the next couple of months. When this started 30 years ago, it was a government-led initiative. Mm-hmm. When NAFTA was launched by President Bush 1, President Salinas and Prime Minister Mulroney of Canada, not everybody in the private sector was willing to go forward. Mexico at that time was a very closed economy. We used to be very inward looking, and there were very important parts of the Mexican private sector that did not want to be part of NAFTA. But the Mexican government, the US government, and the Canadian governments were successful enough to convince and to have the political will and the political initiative to put in place NAFTA. And NAFTA has been a remarkable success, and thanks to that success, today roles have reversed. Today, the main engine of integration and the main advocates for integration comes from the private sector. And that's a big difference. So to answer the question of how integration is going to go forward will depend very much on the private sector of the three countries being successful enough and active enough to make governments behave. Because one of the most important things that have happened lately is that particularly Mexico and Canada pay lip service to integration, but in reality, they have been violating the agreement. In Mexico, particularly in Mexico, and most importantly, recently in the US. So what we have and we will have next year is an opportunity under the formal renegotiations/review process of NAFTA, of the USMCA, to really put our house in order. So the way integration will go forward will depend very much on what happens next year with USMCA, and that would be my initial points for this discussion. Thank you.
Okay, well, in that sense, it's important that you are describing that we have a very uncertain umbrella under which we operate, and that very much depends on what the specific industries do and plan and integrate in their strategic process. However, for energy, it needs regulation. Obviously, it needs integration among the three countries, but it needs a very specific amount of policy and regulatory issues in order for it to be successful and in order for the industry to be able to invest. In that sense, I'd like to go to the US before we come back to Mexico because it's kind of our favorite and it's a little bit more colorful. But certain things are happening in the US that are important that we discuss. And I'd like to leave you guys with this question, which is, what's going on in the electricity sector in the US in terms of growth of generation or the need for growth in generation coming from demand? And what does that mean for the specific regulations of the many different interconnections in the US? I think it's something that it's worth our while to understand and that we don't discuss too much. Spencer, do you want to pitch in first?
Sure. I'm happy to start off with that question. So NEMA actually just released a study on grid demand looking out to 2050. And we predict a 50% increase in electricity by 2050. That's a 2% increase every year. In the most near term, 300% of that comes from data centers. And in the out years, it's the electrification of transportation. So in short, we have not seen demand growth like this really in the history of electricity in the United States since electricity was invented. And it's a very exciting time. I think that it's reflected in the investment in the industry that we've seen from certainly NEMA member companies and others in the industry. And there are a number of policies that the administration is trying to pursue and that Congress is trying to pursue to help meet that demand. Permitting reform is certainly critical to not just on the generation side, but on the transmission side, and we're hopeful that they can make some progress there. But also the supply chain interconnectivity of the three countries that we were just talking about are going to be very important to also help to help meet that demand as manufacturers continue to kind of pull supply chains away from China they're increasingly reliant on friendshoring and nearshoring in Mexico and Canada and the United States. Our members have the electrical manufacturing sector has invested over $200 million, billion dollars, excuse me, just in the United States since USMCA was renegotiated, and that investment is continuing to pour in. So it is critical that at least in regards to USMCA, that the private sector remind the president that his renegotiated NAFTA has been successful in the last 8 years of implementation to increase the supply chain reliability of all three countries.
Courtney, do you want to begin?
Absolutely. So I think illustrative of what Spencer has outlined there is TE's example of our recent acquisition of Richards Manufacturing. So just for context, TE is a $16 billion a year company. We acquired Richards Manufacturing, which specializes in grid solutions, in this last year, and that was a $2.3 billion investment. That particular company that we acquired is really focused on the North American region. So clearly, as a global manufacturer, TE has identified this region as a very important piece of our portfolio and really important to global integration as well, and a real opportunity for us as a company. So related to that, kind of the important aspects of that grid hardening that is taking place and is a priority of the U.S. government is to power the AI solutions and also data centers. We're also a manufacturer of components that go into those industries. So kind of on the both supply side and then on the demand side, we are positioned well, I think, for these growth sectors in North America, but seeing the integration between the two, between the three regions, but for TE in particular, the US and Mexico on the electrical grid front, I think is going to be increasingly important. So reflective of that investment we've made.
Because do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd like to. So what Spencer just mentioned, I think it's we've never seen, to your point, we've never seen such a huge amount of demand concentrated or led by one specific sector. But then I want to bring us back to understand how, on paper, this can be written every day. Executing that growth is going to be a challenge, because the challenge with that amount of electricity that is being demanded by the AI hyperscale data centers is that it's concentrated in one place. So you don't have that spread all over the country. So the speed of execution for generation, the way we know it and historically have known it, and transmission and distribution is not going to be able to meet that demand. So that's where we're seeing a faster and faster evolution of distributed energies, including the SMRs, the small nuclear reactors, that are being developed now at that very fast pace in the US. That's why you're seeing more and more solar technology storage so that you can really meet that demand. At the same time, you need to strengthen the grid, because otherwise you have large pools of concentrated energy that is being generated that eventually could go back into the grid. And you need to guarantee that stability. So I invite you to think about the next 25 years. For the last 150 years, we've seen electricity being generated and going into the flow of what is being consumed. And in the next 25 years, we're going to be seeing a lot of electricity being generated where it's going to be consumed that can potentially come back into the grid. And how to manage that in the U.S. and other economies, but this is very particular specific to the U.S., it's a challenge to be resolved. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to bring us to Mexico, which is please. More colorful. And I could talk about Canada, but it's slightly different reality in Canada. But Mexico, we also have a need for electricity and all the supply chain that is around it, right? The challenge in Mexico, we don't have in spite of what you are reading in the news and was announced last week, big investments on data centers in Querétaro, and for those of you that are not Mexican, Querétaro is 2 hours and a half from here, 3 hours with traffic. Yeah, you have a lot of data centers there, but it's not the hyperscale AI-driven data centers. There's some of it, but it's not the same type of demand that we're seeing in the US. Mexico is not an AI hub, you know? In spite of what we may be reading in the news, it is not. The need for electricity that we have in Mexico is to enable the continued growth of Mexico. We ran out of it. Our big pole of manufacturing, traditional manufacturing, a lot of it is in Nuevo León and in Monterrey, and it is a reality. You need 7 megawatts of electricity today in Monterrey, in Apodaca. It's hard to find it.
Impossible.
It's really hard to find it. Out of respect for some of the audience that works in Nuevo León and he supported us a lot, yeah, it's fairly impossible. And it's also true in some of the places. So we need electricity to have traditional manufacturing, whether it's a large manufacturing company or small, we need electricity to enable that growth. And again, I want to invite you to think about speed of execution. The way historically we've done this in Mexico has been through CFE and some big players, whether you call it Iberdrola or Cox right now and others, but we need more distributed energy because we cannot do it the traditional way. You cannot have the amount of electricity where we need it, right? You cannot enable the Querétaros and the San Luis Potosí and other areas. So we need clear rules of engagement on the Plan Mexico. And yes, last Friday, I haven't digested all the laws that were published last Friday.
Whomever says that
in
has
principle,
digested it, he's lying.
Okay.
Because nobody has.
So hopefully these rules that were published last Friday on how the electric and energy sector in general will work will truly clarify how private sector can go in and invest. But we need the public sector to pitch in as well. It won't. I represent the private sector. We're not generators of energy. We enable. We have all the infrastructure to enable that go from generation to consumption. On behalf of my peers in the private sector in Mexico, I can tell you, we're not going to put the money in if we don't see public sector putting it in. It has to be a balanced investment. And the challenge from the private sector standpoint is the money ready and available to support all the ambition on energy infrastructure at the point in time, That's kind of where we stand. So it's that uncertainty that needs to be resolved that goes beyond the rules. We wanted the rules, but we need more than the rules.
Yeah, but on that note, I think it's not a question of resources. Are there in the world available resources to meet this challenge? I think it's a combination of all the different issues that bring about success. One is you need the rules. The second is you need to understand that the sector, because of the technological realities, it needs an integrated grid. But now technology has given you the possibility of having distributed islands that allow you to meet that demand in a different way than we've seen it in the past 100 years. It's changing, and technology is changing very fast, and so the rules and the reality of investment has to change along with that. And I think in the US that has meant that the interconnections have not faced this demand growth because they have been focused on demand control and efficiencies, and that has sort of driven the whole environment of the electricity sector in the US. In Mexico, it has been completely different, and now the reality is different because now demand is growing exponentially, and now you need to bring generation from everywhere. And that entails a distributed approach and also a grid approach. And we need the standards. The standards are there, but regulation has been evolving. In Mexico, we need energy, whatever it comes from, and we need to be able to do it in an ordinate way. However, and that might bring us back to the integration of the economies. How do you guys foresee the challenge for different approaches in terms of policy in both countries and Canada as well, but a reality of we need more energy and we need it fast and we need it to be available for growth, and not every part of the country needs it as fast as the other. And that brings sort of an integration of goals as well, from the private sector and from the public sector as well. How do you see that?
Let me jump in and go back to my initial remarks in terms of what I see is the crucial questions for the three governments. And I think that they have to decide if they want to face this challenge together or alone. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a very big question, because what we have been seeing lately, particularly to some extent in Mexico, but most importantly in the US, is that they don't see this as a regional project. Mm-hmm. If you look at what has been happening, particularly in the trade issues, which is the things that I know, it's true that the only agreement that has been partially respected by President Trump is USMCA, because a great part of our exports are entering into the US duty-free, but close to 30% or more than our exports are paying duties between 25 and 50%. And some of these duties are being paid particularly in these sectors, in the sectors that you need for the energy integration to go forward. We have this example of transformers, which is in huge demand in the US. We have here a representative of a very successful Mexican-US company that supplies transformers. And there is a huge shortage of transformers in the US. And in spite of that, the US government has applied Section 232 on some of these transformers. So unless we have a common view and a common approach and take advantage of the renegotiation to put our three houses in order, mm-hmm. and go back to this regional view of integration and have tailwinds instead of headwinds. What we have today is that integration is going forward very quickly and very strongly in spite of the three governments. Mm-hmm. And what we need is the three governments working together to foster and promote integration. I'm not an expert on regulations and on electricity regulations, but I do see that there's plenty of room to work together and make integration much easier. And I think that unless that happens, integration will keep growing, but thanks to inertia and thanks to a very strong forces that are already there. But it could be even stronger and much more positive. So I do think that the private sector of three countries have to play a role pushing our three governments to go back to the table and try to harmonize and eliminate some of the obstacles that have been preventing integration to go forward.
I might throw a provocation there. That, Jaime, assumes that we can face, or we are expecting, some rationality in terms of economic policy and politics. And lately in the world, that rationality is not all too clear. So what is the position from the industry, and how do you guys face all these new realities where the government is not going to be the first one stepping into clarity in terms of the rules and so on and so forth, but you still need to operate and you still need to take advantage of integration and the opportunities for growth in all of the three countries. How do you do that?
Now I'll put my Schneider Electric hat.
Yes.
And we employ over 18,000 people in Mexico. We have more than 12 operating plants, and so we have a Mexico for Mexico business, but 80%, give or take, of what we manufacture goes to the U.S. So we're the poster child for what USMCA is, and taking advantage of Mexico as a strong manufacturing hub for the U.S. Some of it goes to Canada. Look, I'll confess, I think from that standpoint, there is a listening, if some of you were in the panels yesterday, the opening panels, that we have several Canadian colleagues, and I'll put back my Canadian hat from when I lived there. Canada is living this reality very different. Canada already realized that the rules of the game change, that we're not going back to where we were back in January. And I was talking to another colleague that is part of the foundation board with me and Emilio, and she tells me, Jesus, nobody in DC is talking about USMCA like you guys do in Mexico. In DC, they're all talking about, it's security, it's fentanyl. Mexico only talks about USMCA. The US is not talking about USMCA like Mexico. So you're going to sleep thinking that everybody in the US is worried about USMCA, and they're not, to the extent that we are in Mexico. And this has to be a wake-up call for us, because the rules of the game have changed. Now we're using trade. We think about trade, and we used to negotiate, like Jaime said, it was trade for trade and then security for security. Now it's all intertwined. So the challenge is, if you are establishing Mexico or thinking about establishing yourself in Mexico to manufacture for the US, is that it's not the logic rationale that we've been applying for the last 30 years, where it was, we're competitive, we have the labor, we can do it, we have integrated supply chains, and well, yes, all of that is true, but the US administration is looking at two other factors, security and fentanyl and others, that will influence in a very strong way, even definitive way, whether trade is possible the way we've seen it before. And I think in Mexico, we're in the process of potentially waking up to that new reality, but I don't think we have internalized it just yet. And I'm speaking as a representative of Mexican industry. We are not there yet. We want it badly to go back to where it was. And honestly, I confess, I don't think we're going back to where it was.
No, we're not. Spencer, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, a couple points. It is important, if you think about the priorities of this administration, and putting tariffs aside for a second, you look at some of the top domestic priorities. It's bringing back domestic manufacturing, it's energy dominance, and winning the AI race, right, with China and globally. Those three are in direct contradiction, oftentimes, to the trade and tariff policy, and so there's a lot of education that needs to be done amongst many areas of the administration, and how those four priorities can maybe work together. And so I'll just say that's something that we are working on to try to help folks at Commerce and others understand some of those supply chains and how USMCA or other trading partners are critical to helping achieve those other really top priority goals for the administration. So that's one. I think too on USMCA going forward, I don't think it's not going to be the same, as it was, and I think that was clear from the renegotiation from the original NAFTA. There's a long-standing distrust, I think, within the United States and certain communities about how NAFTA was implemented and how it impacted domestic jobs and manufacturing, and so that was part of really the platform that President Trump ran on in 2016, and that has been a longstanding view of his. He probably has, one consistent public policy his entire life, and it's on trade. So it's very difficult to influence in that area, but it is it's something that I hope that we can get to a more of a reasonable conversation between the three countries as we're getting closer to what will likely be a renegotiation in the coming year.
Courtney, anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I would just add that on the USMCA front, from the perspective of the US, I think the government is viewing it in terms of a much broader global reset of trade. So I think the technical aspects are not quite as maybe commonplace in normal commercial to government interactions, either through our trade associations, industry groups. I think those technical conversations haven't really begun yet, if they are to take place at all in the future. But I think when we as a business are trying to figure out, what that certainty that a free trade agreement provides us, understanding that the U.S. has sovereignty priorities and domestic priorities that can be solved through trade agreements. I think that message is one that at least business side needs to focus on more, in communicating how to achieve those domestic goals through agreements like USMCA. So whether that's focusing on rare earths that the U.S. doesn't have access to it, or that permitting reform has not taken place yet, and there are barriers to having the supply to achieve those important ramp-ups. I think the reframing of trade negotiations overall, zooming out from maybe a more diplomatic and soft power place, needs to come down to like true economics again. So just an
I guess-
observation.
Yeah, but now we're going back to the beginning where Jaime was stating that when NAFTA came about, it was the government's pushing for something that the private sector was reluctant. And now we came full circle, and now it's the governments are reluctant, and the private sector will need to push and make its case, both political and technical, for whatever agreements we come up with. And then there remains the issue of, are agreements at this point in time credible, lasting? And there's a question of, we are living in a world where things change very quickly, both technologically but also politically. And I guess the private sector needs to learn to thrive in that environment, regardless. I mean, it's different, but it is reality now. So it's interesting how we came back to the beginning with Jaime saying, now it's the private sector that needs to push this. My question is, where and how, and to what extent? How technically sound should this be? How organized, sort of, through these platforms, U.S.-Mexico Foundation, et cetera, how do these institutions, from your standpoint, help the industries you represent to bring this voice to the governments that need to listen? Because one thing is absolute. We do need some public policy and regulation ground to let you thrive. There's no way we can do without. Even if things are all changing, we do need some standard of I don't know, civilization is not the word, but the basic ground rules under which you operate.
Montserrat, let
How do you see that?
me try to see if I can address this. I think that what we have heard from all my colleagues is that obviously the world has changed, and the change has been very dramatic, and the priorities, particularly on the part of the U.S., but not only in the U.S., but particularly in the U.S., has changed also a lot. So I think that the challenge of the private sector is to how to find a narrative that makes integration, that makes a very strong argument for integration in this new reality and with these new priorities. And I do think that Mexico-US-Canada integration makes sense in that new reality, because by working together, we could increase national security for the US, for example, because the US is much safer relying in Mexico and Canada suppliers than relying on suppliers from everywhere else, because the US, as much as they want, won't be ever self-sufficient in everything. So they will have to buy from somebody, and buying from Mexico and Canada is much better. So that's one thing. The other thing, and we all know this, is that Mexico and Canada buy from the US much more than any other country. So that's what the private sector of the three countries have to work together to come up with this narrative that has to be adjusted to the new reality and the new priorities of the three governments, particularly the US, and then go to the US and make these arguments. I fully agree that as much as I would like to go back to the NAFTA years, that's impossible. That's already, the genie's out of the lamp. But we have to deal with this new reality and find the narrative and the arguments which are there. And we have the evidence, and we've, in very deep contrast to what we had 30 years ago. 30 years ago, all the things that we said about integration was speculation. Today, we have the evidence. We have the evidence of the three countries working together, and by working together, we could raise not only welfare for the three countries, but particularly national security for the US.
Yeah, and I think there's not much that the two parties agree on in Washington these days, but removing supply chains away from China is probably one that has near unanimous support across both parties. And so to the extent that that narrative involves the kind of decoupling from China for national security and economic security and all the other reasons that is, I think, going to be a critical part of that story to be told. And our sector's done it quite well, really, over the last 8 or 9 years. We've moved about 18% supply chains away from China, either back to the United States, to Mexico, or elsewhere. And so I think we see that trend continuing.
I think there is a physical aspect to it, and we are not there yet, because I think this is also new to all three countries, that we're in the process of digesting what the new landscape is, and it's not even clear yet. What we know is that it's changing, but we don't know what it looks like. I do agree with Jaime. Let's go back to your first question. Let's go back to this reality that we have a massive, sorry, Spencer, you made a point, that we have a massive, the amount of energy that is going to be needed in the next 25 years equals what we've seen in growth in demand over the last 150 years. And let's go back to the comment I made. You cannot make it with traditional manufacturing, traditional way of providing energy, and so on and so forth. If you just isolate the US, it is physically impossible to meet the demand bringing all manufacturing into the US. And you will not see it today with Richards because you have a lot of capacity, but at some point in time, all of that demand, today, if you want to expand a McDonald's, or you want to do an expansion or an upgrade on a mall, a shopping mall in Florida, you are competing versus a data center for equipment, for electrical equipment. That transformer reality that Jaime just mentioned, it's a reality everywhere.
It's a 2-year wait for
It's
a
a 2-year wait.
transformer. And the data centers are going to get it before the
Always,
mom and pop,
because they're paying premium.
car wash. Yeah.
And one thing that I want you to think, without getting too technical, is North America is a bubble in terms of electrical energy and electrical infrastructure, because we work very harmonized under NEMA standards. So the way we have a circuit breaker in our houses, if you're in Mexico, the US, or Canada, it looks 99% the same. Small difference between Canadian standards and US standards in Mexico, but it's 99% the same. Functionally, it's the same breaker that you will have in Paris or Madrid or Shanghai. But from a standard standpoint, you cannot install or buy one that is for China, for India, for Europe, for Brazil. So we're isolated. So we are North America for North America electrical infrastructure region. And we did that by design, and that's great. But at the end, we're going to reach a point where we're going to hit a wall and we say, oops, I cannot do it alone in the US. I need urgent the help and the supply chains from Mexico and Canada just to respond to our demand. Now, is that 3 years away, 4 years away, 5 years away? I honestly don't have a clue. But it's not a 10 years away, time frame.
Nothing is 10 years away anymore.
Well, yeah. So we're going to have, it's going to be great for you. It's going to be great for us. The manufacturer is going to be fantastic in business. But that roadblock, it's coming. And I think that will help from a physical reality standpoint. It will lead the markets to that beautiful phrase of self-regulation. We'll face a reality that will force us to dialogue, maybe in ways that today we're not open to dialogue because we're just redefining the landscape.
Well, I'm a former regulator, so self-regulation kind of creeps me. But
Call
yes.
it differently. My
Yeah,
wife
but-
self-regulates me a
but
lot.
yes, in the end, the name of the game now, because it's so fast, regulation will always be a little behind the technology and industrial realities. So we need to acknowledge that. And the governments need to acknowledge that too. I guess we need to wrap up. And one of the things that I would like you guys to do, and I'll go first, is probably think about 3 different things that we can do better. I mean, we'll all be in accordance, but one of the things, I guess, is just knowing that we are in uncharted territory and needs to be a fast approach to it. The region needs all the energy it can get, and the only way of doing it is working together. Anything else? Courtney?
I would say, in terms of integration of the grids, incentivizing the sharing of information, both from field inspections to having kind of smart and responsive systems that can calibrate appropriately to surplus areas to meet demand, given that we have such varied topographical and geographical challenges across this region. So having the flexibility within the grid, I think, is going to be increasingly important. And then I think, from the critical mineral perspective, that's a necessary underpinning. So moving forward in USMCA or otherwise, having more regional conversations about how to build resilience within our grids via access to those natural resources is going to be really important.
Okay.
So I'll take off my government affairs hat and put on my communications hat for this answer, because I think this is really a storytelling exercise. The president loves a good story. The president likes to hear that he negotiated a great deal for USMCA and that he could get a better deal. And so, in renegotiation. And so I think to the extent that the 3 countries in the private sector that is, fully integrated within those 3 countries can come together and really tell this great story that we have, particularly in this sector, that's going to be the biggest thing that we can do to get a favorable outcome in the near term on USMCA and some of the other challenges that we face. So good comms is always helpful.
Well, I fully subscribe what my colleagues were saying. We are now, the 3 governments are in the process of carrying on consultations for the negotiation. The process is open, so I would really pressure everybody in the private sector to raise the voice and make the argument for the integration, taking into consideration the new reality and the new arguments. So in the short term, participate in the consultations. Don't let the space without raising the voice. And then keep close to the process. Because as Jesús was saying, nobody pay attention to USMCA in the US. We are not a priority. We have to make integration a priority during 2026. And then give President Trump his triumph. And then he will come out and he will say, now I have the second best agreement ever negotiated. We have to work towards that end next year.
And to complement, I'll share my perspective. I lived in Canada, the US, I lived and worked in Canada, the US, and Mexico. And I've been here for the last 8 years. And I very recently realized that I've been looking at all of this only from my Mexican vantage point. I didn't spend enough time trying to understand why is the US administration doing this? How are they looking at it? And why? Because there's a rationale. I had a great professor at Duke called Dan Ariely. He has a great book called Predictably Irrational that tells you about how you gotta see things from other people's vantage point. And I think we need to do more of that. You know, the way we're looking at this from a Mexican standpoint, from a Mexican IP standpoint, it's not the same way a company in the US is looking at it, you know? And it's not right or wrong. There's no right or wrong. There's just a different vantage point. You're looking at the same problem from a different angle and from a different perspective. And I think that's a good first step, because now that I'm starting to look at this from, why is America doing this? Why are they going after? Why is it not to them as important as it is to me? Why they don't understand that 85% of Mexican exports go to the US, that we cannot substitute that our installed base of manufacturing in Mexico doesn't work on Mexico for Mexico, that every time you impose trade restraints or demand slows in the US, you are firing 150,000 people in Chihuahua, which is year to date the number of people that have been let go in Chihuahua. That's massive. So, and we leave unemployment in Mexico very different than the way we leave unemployment in the US. I'm not saying it's good in the US and bad, but we leave it differently. So this touches us in Mexico in a way that is not fully appreciated in the US and vice versa. I think we need to do more of that.
So what you're saying is we need an integrated private sector approach, not only in terms of the economies and as a broader idea, but the private sector itself needs to have a more integrated framework so we can be more successful pushing for frameworks and realities that have changed and that we need.
And that's why, on behalf of the US-Mexico Foundation, thanks for being here, because that's what we're trying to do with this forum, right? That's exactly what we're trying to do, to listen to each other, all three countries, industry, private sector, public sector, and try to understand each other's vantage point.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And
I hope we accomplish it, you know.
It was a very good conclusion, not planned, but it just came. Well, thank you all.